Hello, dear listeners. You are safe now, but the darkness is not. It is patient. It is a silent, breathing thing woven into the geography of a quiet road, into the fabric of forgotten dates, into the spaces between two people who trusted a moonlit evening. It is a lesson in how completely a human being can vanish, and how the truth can die with them, leaving behind only a chilling, perfect silence. This is a story of 4 pairs of victims, 8 lives extinguished along a scenic Virginia roadway. This is a story of a hunter who used the landscape itself as a weapon. This is a story of evidence that dissolved, of leads that evaporated, of a killer whose face remains a ghost in the police file. This is the story of the Colonial Parkway murders. And it begins with a simple, terrifying fact. The perfect crime may not be a myth. It may be a series of unsolved case numbers, waiting in the dark. The Colonial Parkway is a postcard. 23 miles of winding asphalt stitching together the historic triangle of Jamestown, Williamsburg, and Yorktown. By day, it's a vista of sun-dappled water and autumn leaves. By night, it becomes something else entirely. A tunnel of shadows, a ribbon of isolation where the lights of civilization are just distant, untouchable suggestions. It's a place built for romance, for private conversation, for pulling over to watch the moonlight on the James River, and that made it the perfect hunting ground. The first double homicide that would later be linked to a single, shadowy pattern happened on October 12, 1986. Kathleen Thomas and Rebecca Dowski were last seen at a bar in Williamsburg. Their car, a white Honda Civic, was found 2 days later, parked awkwardly at the edge of a ravine near the York River. Both women were inside. They had been brutally murdered, but the scene defied easy logic. This wasn't a simple robbery gone wrong, or a crime of passion. There was a meticulous, almost clinical nature to the violence. The killer had taken extraordinary steps to stage the scene, to misdirect, to sow confusion into the very fabric of the investigation from its first moments. The car's ignition was turned on, the battery dead. Their purses, with money inside, were left in plain view. This immediately scrambled the motive. It whispered of something far more complex than greed. It whispered of a killer who was playing a game, whose satisfaction came not just from the act, but from the chaos that followed. The forensic paradox was immediate and glaring. A violent, intimate crime scene that showed no signs of a struggle inside the vehicle, and a staging so obvious it felt like a taunt. A taunt that would hang in the damn Virginia air for 2 years, unanswered, before the pattern struck again. Picture yourself as the first officer on that scene. The mist is rising off the river. The car is silent. You approach, your flashlight beam cutting through the fog, and you see them. The horror is immediate, but then your training kicks in. You look for disruption, for stolen items, for the obvious clues, and you find only contradictions. The money is there. The keys are in the ignition. It looks, on a superficial level, like a tragic accident. A couple who pulled over and met some terrible end. But the wounds tell a different story. A story written in a language of pure malice. You are standing at the genesis of a nightmare, and you don't even know it yet. You are witnessing the opening move of a predator who understood that the most powerful weapon is not a knife or a gun, but a paradox. A paradox stops an investigation in its tracks, sends detectives down rabbit holes, and buys the killer the one thing they need more than anything: time to disappear back into the ordinary world. In 1986, forensic science was on the cusp of revolution. DNA typing was just being pioneered in the UK. But here, on this muddy riverbank, the investigation would hinge on shoe leather, witness statements, and gut instinct. And the gut instinct was screaming that this was different. This was the start of something. But what? The cliffhanger wasn't just who killed Kathleen and Rebecca. The cliffhanger was this. Had they just caught the beginning of a series? Or was this a monstrous, one-off anomaly? The answer would come 20 months later, in the exact same geographic heart, and would confirm every investigator's deepest dread. The quiet that followed the Thomas Dowski murders was the most deceptive kind. It wasn't the quiet of a case going cold. It was the quiet of a predator lying in wait, learning, refining. For 20 months, the Colonial Parkway breathed easily. Then, On September 5th, 1988, the pattern spoke again. This time, the victims were David Knobling and Robin Edwards. They were younger. He was 20, she was 14. They told friends they were going to the Walmart parking lot to meet someone about a car. They vanished. For days later, their bodies were discovered on the shore of the Ragged Island Wildlife Management Area, near the James River Bridge, a location accessible from, but not directly on, the parkway. David Knobling had been shot in the back of the head. Robin Edwards had been shot in the head as well. Their clothing was found arranged neatly beside them. Their vehicle, a pickup truck, was discovered days later, abandoned in the parking lot of the James River Pier. The staging was different in detail, but eerily familiar in spirit. Again, there was no robbery. Again, the scene felt managed, controlled, but the method had evolved. The killer had switched from hands-on violence to the distant, clinical efficiency of a firearm. This is a critical pivot in any behavioral profile. It suggests adaptation, a comfort with different tools, or perhaps a desire to create psychological distance. Yet the core signature, the targeting of a couple in a secluded, romantic spot, the lack of material motive, the deliberate positioning of the scene, remained intact. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, consulted informally, began to sketch the outlines of a particular mind. This was an organized offender. He likely used a ruse to approach the vehicles, a show of authority, a police badge, a security uniform, or a plea for help to lower the window or unlock the door. He exerted absolute control. He was a planner. He brought his tools with him, and he took trophies, not of valuables, but the experience itself. The memory, the power, the silence he left behind. Now the paradox deepened, and the investigation's tunnel vision began to fracture under the weight of two linked crimes. The Lover's Lane killer theory was born in the press, and a chilling reality set in for every young person in southeastern Virginia. A date could be a death sentence. The task force, combining resources from the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, NCIS, as Knobling's father was a Navy contractor, the Virginia State Police, and the FBI's VICAP, Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, began the monumental task of cross-referencing thousands of tips, alibis, and potential suspects. They were looking for a needle in a haystack the size of the Atlantic coastline. Consider the data. By 1988, VICAP was in its infancy, a cumbersome system of paper forms. Linking crimes across jurisdictions was a manual, bureaucratic nightmare. The killer exploited this systemic fragility perfectly. He operated on a corridor that straddled multiple county and federal park jurisdictions, a legal no man's land where communication breakdowns were inevitable. He wasn't just killing, he was hacking the system itself. And as the fall of 1988 turned to winter, the pressure on the task force was a living thing. They knew he would kill again. The only questions were when, where, and if they could see him coming this time. The cliffhanger now was taught as a tripwire. The killer had shown he could change his method. What would his next evolution look like? Would he return to the knife, stick to the gun, or unveil something new? The answer would come with shocking speed, and would drag the investigation into a world of military secrets, broken allegiances, and a suspect so perfect he seemed almost fictional. The double homicide of Cassandra Haley and Richard Keith Call on April 9th, 1988, actually occurred between the first two canonical Parkway murders, but its definitive linkage to the series would come later. This case was always the anomaly, the jagged piece that both fit and didn't. Call was a 20-year-old sailor stationed at the Naval Weapons Station, Yorktown. Haley was an 18-year-old civilian. They vanished after a date. Their car, a brown Chrysler, was found 2 days later, abandoned on the side of the parkway near the Williamsburg Tunnel. There was no immediate sign of the couple. The car was locked. Inside, investigators found Keith Call's wallet. Its contents were strewn about, but his military ID was conspicuously missing. This single detail screamed louder than a gunshot to the naval investigators on the task force. It pointed to a killer with a specific, perhaps personal, interest in the military, or, more terrifyingly, it pointed to someone within the military structure itself. The missing ID wasn't a trophy in the traditional sense. It was a key. A key to what? Access? Intimidation? A symbolic act of stripping a serviceman of his identity? The search for Haley and Call was massive, involving helicopters and ground teams scouring the dense, swampy woods bordering the parkway. But the land gave up no secrets. It was as if the earth had swallowed them whole. For months, they were simply missing. Then, in October 1988, just weeks after the Nobbling Edwards bodies were found, a hunter stumbled upon a skeletal remnant in a wooded area near the parkway. It was Cassandra Haley. Keith Call's remains were found a short distance away. The cause of death could not be determined due to decomposition, but the placement, the missing ID, and the geographic proximity to the other crimes slammed the puzzle piece into place, albeit crookedly. The killer's hunting ground was now undeniable, and his potential connection to the world of naval operations became the investigation's brightest, hottest lead, and the first major suspect, a man whose very existence reads like a conspiracy theory. He was a former naval intelligence officer, a skilled sailor, and a diagnosed psychopath. He had been stationed in the area during the time of the murders. He owned weapons. He was known to have violent, sadistic sexual fantasies. He was intellectually arrogant, precisely the type to enjoy outwitting a multi-agency task force. He even, in a chilling moment during an interrogation, drew a map of the Colonial Parkway that was disturbingly accurate. He knew the pull-offs, the sight lines, the dead zones. He was, in the words of one investigator, the most perfectly configured suspect they had ever encountered. He was interviewed multiple times. He took polygraphs with mixed results. His alibis were shaky, built on the unverifiable solitude of sailing alone on the Chesapeake Bay. The task force was convinced they had their man. But then, the forensic wall loomed. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, without DNA or definitive physical evidence linking him to any of the crime scenes, a prosecution was impossible. He was a ghost in the machine, a profile made flesh. But he remained just beyond the grasp of the law. He later moved away, changed his name, and lived a quiet life, forever shadowed by suspicion but never charged. The cliffhanger he left behind was existential for detectives. What do you do when you find a perfect suspect, and the entire world of evidence says maybe? Do you continue to chase a ghost, or do you accept that the system, as it existed, was powerless against a clever, organized killer? This man's shadow would stretch across the entire case for decades, a permanent fixture in the suspect gallery. But the real killer, if it was not him, was still out there, and he was about to commit his final, most brazen act, one that would unfold not in the darkness of Parkway, but in the bustling heart of a Virginia Beach town. The fourth and final pair of murders broke the pattern in terrifying ways, proving the killer was not a creature of rigid habit, but a thinking, adapting predator. On May 26, 1989, Anna Maria Phelps and Daniel Lauer were on a first date. They went to a concert at the Virginia Beach oceanfront, a crowded, well-lit resort area miles away from the secluded, wooded intimacy of the Parkway. This was a fundamental shift in victim acquisition strategy. It suggested confidence, a willingness to hunt in a higher-risk environment. After the concert, they vanished. Their car, a white Toyota Tercel, was found 4 days later in the parking lot of the First Landing State Park, which is connected to the northern terminus of the Colonial Parkway. The car was locked. Inside, investigators found Anna Maria's purse. Daniel's wallet was on the dashboard. Their money was untouched. The echo was unmistakable. The couple's bodies were discovered 2 weeks later in a remote, watery ditch in New Kent County, nearly 50 miles from where they were last seen. Both had been shot. The staging elements were present, but again, altered. The killer was communicating, not with the police, but with his own evolving fantasy. The move to the oceanfront was a monumental clue. It meant the killer was comfortable in both worlds, the lonely wilderness and the neon-lit boardwalk. He could blend in. He could be charming. He could be the guy no one noticed in a crowd of thousands. This fact alone expanded the suspect pool exponentially. He could be a sailor on Liberty, a college student, a trucker, a salesman, anyone with mobility and a plausible reason to be in both environments. The investigation into the Phelps-Lauer murders created a vortex of new data. Hundreds of people had seen them at the concert. Their last known hours were a blur of potential witnesses. The task force was inundated with tips, each one requiring 100 man-hours to vet and dismiss. This was the killer's second layer of defense, overwhelming the system with noise. While the earlier crimes were defined by a lack of evidence, this one offers surplus of the wrong kind. Leads that led nowhere, sightings that contradicted each other, a digital fog for its time of information. The behavioral profilers from Quantico zeroed in on the travel. The killer had transported two conscious adult victims a significant distance, first a parked car location, then to the final dump site. This requires control, a vehicle large enough, and a location he felt was utterly secure. It spoke of pre-planning, of a kill zone he had scouted in advance. The fact that he returned the car to a state park linked to the parkway was a classic signature gesture, a return to his domain, a symbolic closing of the circle. By the summer of 1989, the task force was facing a hydra. They had 4 crime scenes, 8 victims, a prime suspect they couldn't charge, a geographic profile that spanned from Virginia Beach to the rural woods of New Kent County, and a public panic that was reaching a fever pitch. Then, as abruptly as it began, the killing stopped. The silence that followed was louder than any gunshot. Was it because the prime suspect moved away? Was the killer imprisoned for another crime? Did he die? Or did he simply stop? The ultimate cliffhanger was born not from an action, but from an absence. Why did the Colonial Parkway murders end? The answer to that question may hold the key to the killer's identity, and it's a silence that has lasted for over 3 decades. The crime scenes of the Colonial Parkway murders are a study in negative space. It's not just about what was found. It's about what wasn't. In the Thomas Dowski case, despite the brutal, hands-on nature of the killings, no usable fingerprints were recovered from the car's exterior or interior that pointed to an outsider. No foreign hairs, no definitive fibers under fingernails. The killer either wore gloves, was incredibly careful, or possessed a knowledge of forensic countermeasures that was advanced for the mid-'80s. In the Nobbling Edwards case, the bullets were .22 caliber, common, virtually untraceable without a matching gun. The shells were recovered, but without a weapon. They were silent. The clothing found arranged beside the bodies yielded no transfer evidence. The killer had managed the scene like a director, ensuring no stray DNA, a term not even in the investigative lexicon at the time, was left behind. He was a ghost in a physical sense. This forensic void is the central paradox of the case. 8 people were killed across multiple crime scenes involving different methods, and yet the perpetrator left no biological calling card that could be identified. In today's world of MVAC systems that can suck DNA from the pores of a rock, of forensic genetic genealogy that can build a family tree from a single skin cell, this void feels almost supernatural. But it's not. It's the mark of extreme organization, of ritual, and of time. The killer had the time to clean up, to stage, to leave only what he wanted to be seen. This void had a profound psychological impact on the investigation. Without physical evidence to anchor theories, detectives were forced to rely on the notoriously fragile architecture of witness memory and behavioral deduction. Tips flooded and based on dreams, on hunches, on suspicious neighbors. Every sex offender within a 100-mile radius was scrutinized. The case files ballooned into mountains of paper, a monument to uncertainty. The lack of a smoking gun, forensic clue, also fostered division. Could one man really be responsible for all 4? The so-called linkage blindness set in. Some investigators, particularly at the local level, resisted the serial killer theory, preferring to see each case as a separate, tragic island. It's a natural human bias. The idea of a roaming, prolific killer in your community is too awful to accept. It was only through persistent work of a core group of task force members and the FBI's VICAP analysts that the linkages were formally established based on the undeniable behavioral through line. Couples, secluded areas, lack of robbery, vehicle staging, and the overtly sexualized violence in several of the crimes. But a behavioral profile is not evidence for a courtroom. It's a guide. And without a physical clue to tie the guide to a specific person, the investigation began to drift. The cliffhanger inherent in this forensic void is a question of technology. What microscopic fragment, invisible to the investigators of 1989, is still sitting in an evidence locker today? A dried speck of saliva on a cigarette, but from the Nobbling Edwards truck? A single shed skin cell caught in the folded cuff of Kathleen Thomas's jeans? The answer is waiting, deep in the archive silence, for the right machine, the right database, the right moment to speak. What can we know about a man who leaves only shadows? The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, working from the cumulative details of the crimes, constructed a profile that is both vivid and frustratingly vague. He was almost certainly a white male, given the demographics of the area and the era's social dynamics. He was likely between 25 and 35 years old at the time of the first murder, which would place him in a period of peak physical confidence and predatory activity. He was organized, intelligent, and possessed a working knowledge of, or at least an intuitive grasp of, police investigative techniques. This could stem from military or law enforcement adjacent employment, but could also come from a simple, obsessive interest in crime stories or true detective magazines. He was a power-assertive killer. His primary motivation was the exercise of total domination over his victims. The sexual element, present in several of the crimes, was a component of that domination, not necessarily the driving force. He needed to see himself as the orchestrator of life and death. The selection of couples is critical. It's a double conquest. It proves a superiority not just over one person, but over a unit, over intimacy itself. He was likely socially adept, able to present a non-threatening facade to approach a vehicle. He may have used a ruse involving authority, a badge, a flashlight, or a plea for assistance. He had a deep, familiar connection to the Colonial Parkway corridor. He knew its rhythms, its pull-offs, its times of solitude. This suggests he lived, worked, or traveled through the area routinely. The expansion to Virginia Beach indicates mobility and comfort in a different, more social environment. The profile suggests he may have held a job that required travel or odd hours, giving him both an alibi and the freedom to hunt. He owned a vehicle suitable for transporting victims, likely a van, a large sedan, or a truck with a cap. He was a collector, but not of objects. He collected experiences. He may have kept detailed records of his crimes, news clippings, maps, souvenirs. He likely followed the media coverage intently, feeding on the public fear and the frustration of the police. The cessation of the murders in 1989 could indicate a life change. Incarceration for a lesser offense, a move, marriage, the onset of an illness, or even death. But a predator of this organization doesn't typically just stop. The fantasy that fueled him doesn't evaporate. It may have morphed or found another outlet. The cliffhanger the profile leaves us with is a face without features. He could be the quiet mechanic, the unassuming clerk, the friendly long-haul trucker. He is the man you don't remember because he was designed to be forgotten. The profile isn't a portrait. It's a mirror reflecting back the terrifying banality of evil. So, if he walked into the room right now, would you know him? The answer, according to the profile, is almost certainly no. Beyond the former naval intelligence officer, the task force accumulated a rogues gallery of potential suspects, each with their own compelling piece of the puzzle, but none with the complete picture. There was the local mechanic with a violent temper and a history of sexual assault, who was known to patrol the parkway. There was a long-haul trucker whose routes crisscrossed the eastern seaboard, whose CB radio handle was ominously familiar, and who was later convicted of a violent rape in another state. There was a college student obsessed with occultism and murder, who wrote disturbing poetry about the parkway. Each was investigated. Each was subjected to the harsh light of scrutiny, and each, ultimately, was cleared or lacked the evidence for a charge. One of the most chilling aspects of a long-term cold case is this proliferation of almosts. Every few years, a new name surfaces, forwarded by a retired detective, a true crime podcaster, or a citizen who finally comes forward. In 2023, A name emerged from the shadows of declassified military records. A soldier stationed at Fort Eustis with a record of brutal disciplinary infractions, who was an area for every single murder. His whereabouts on the specific nights remain unverified, a maddening dead end. These suspects form a constellation of human darkness, each star shining with a plausible motive, opportunity, or behavioral quirk, but without a forensic tether. They remain points of light in a void, never connecting into a conclusive shape. The psychological toll on the detectives assigned to this gallery was immense. Imagine building a case against a man, spending months of your life convinced you found the answer, only to have a single unbreakable alibi or a negative DNA test shatter the entire edifice. It breeds a unique form of professional paranoia. You start to see potential in every angry glance, in every oddball who walks into the station. The what if scenarios become a mental prison? What if the killer was a team? What if it was a copycat who studied the first murder? What if one of the double homicides was unrelated? A coincidence that poisoned the well of the investigation. This last theory has gained traction in online forums, with amateur sleuths arguing that the Haley Call murder, with its missing military ID, was a separate, possibly drug-related hit that was erroneously folded into the series. This theory is seductive because it simplifies things, but the task force, after years of review, stands by the linkages. The behavioral signature, they argue, is a thread that binds them, a thread invisible to the untrained eye but glaringly obvious to those who have stared into the abyss of all four cases. The cliffhanger of the suspect gallery is a question of probability. With so many compelling maybes, is the truth hiding in plain sight among them, or is the real killer a name that never once appeared on an interview log, a ghost who slipped through the net entirely? While investigators chase ghosts, the families of the 8 victims are anchored in a perpetual present of grief and uncertainty. Their tragedy is not a chapter in a history book. It is the air they breathe. For them, the passage of time is not a healing force, but a thief stealing witnesses, fading memories, and dimming the public's attention. They live with a specific, agonizing brand of pain, ambiguous loss. There is no body to bury in some cases for months. In others, there is a body but no reason, no face to assign to malice. There is no courtroom verdict to provide a simulacrum of closure, no confession to explain the inexplicable. They are left with a narrative that ends in a scream, followed by decades of silence. Parents grow old and die without answers. Siblings raise children who know their aunt or uncle only as a photograph and a cautionary tale. The victims themselves are frozen in time, forever 20, forever 18, forever on a first date, while the world moves on. The Colonial Parkway, for these families, is not a scenic drive. It is a haunted geography, a landmine of memory. Every news article about a break in the case sends a jolt of painful hope through their lives, a hope that is often cruelly dashed by the reality of a dead-end lead or a speculative theory. The family members have become reluctant experts, archivists of their own tragedy. They maintain binders of newspaper clippings, copies of police reports, heavily redacted, and timelines more detailed than any official document. They talk to every journalist, every podcaster, not for fame, but to keep the names alive in the public consciousness. They understand, on a visceral level, that a cold case is only as alive as the pressure applied to it. In recent years, they have been the driving force behind pushing for the application of modern forensic techniques. They lobby for the retesting of evidence with MVAC technology, which uses a wet vacuum system to collect DNA from evidence previously thought exhausted. They follow the breakthroughs in genetic genealogy with a fervent, desperate hope. The 2024 arrest in the Golden State Killer case, solved decades after the crimes, is not just a news story to them. It is a beacon, a proof of concept that their wait might not be in vain. But this hope is a double-edged sword. Every time a famous cold case is solved, they are asked, "Do you think yours will be next?" They have to balance the unbearable weight of expectation with the grim reality of evidentiary degradation. The cliffhanger for the families is a personal, daily torture. Will the phone ring in their lifetime with the voice of detectives saying, "We have him"? Or will they pass the mantle of this aching question to the next generation? The Colonial Parkway murders arrived at a cultural inflection point. The late 1980s was the era of America's Most Wanted, of burgeoning true crime paperbacks, a public fascination with serial killers that was shifting from horror to a grim form of entertainment. The case had all the ingredients for myth-making: a romantic, historic setting, young, attractive victims, a shadowy, intelligent killer, and a baffling lack of resolution. The press dubbed him the Colonial Parkway Killer, a name that lent him a monolithic, legendary status. Television news segments featured sweeping helicopter shots of the winding road, set to ominous music. True crime authors penned speculative chapters linking him to other unsolved murders up and down the I-95 corridor. This media ecosystem served two opposing functions. On one hand, it kept the case in the public eye, generating tips and pressure. On the other, it began to distort reality. The killer, in the public imagination, became a supervillain, a cunning phantom who could walk through walls and leave no trace. This mythologizing can be dangerous. It can create a feedback loop where only tips that fit the dramatic narrative are taken seriously, while more mundane, plausible explanations are overlooked. It can also inspire copycats or confessions from the tragically disturbed seeking infamy. Furthermore, the media spotlight intensified the scrutiny on the victims in a way that would be considered deeply unethical today. Newspapers printed details about their personal lives, hinted at their sexual orientations in the case of Thomas and Dowski, and subtly questioned their judgment for being in secluded places at night. This created a secondary victimization, burdening the grieving families with stigma and shame on top of their loss. The mythos of the case also attracted a dedicated following of amateur sleuths, particularly with the rise of the internet in the 1990s and 2000s. Online forums dedicated to the Parkway murders became digital war rooms, where users dissected every scrap of publicly available information, proposed complex theories, and even named their own suspects. This crowdsourced investigation has had mixed results. While it has uncovered forgotten details and kept online discussion alive, it has also led to the harassment of innocent people named in speculation and has occasionally flooded law enforcement with baseless, time-consuming tips. The cliffhanger of the media narrative is this: has the story we tell about the Colonial Parkway murders, the legend of the perfect ghostly killer, actually become an obstacle to solving them? Have we made the killer smarter, more mythic than he ever really was? To understand the inertia of this case, you must step into the worn-out shoes of the task force detectives. They weren't up against a single criminal. They were up against a fog, a miasma of missing evidence, contradictory timelines, jurisdictional quagmires, and a public desperate for an arrest. The task force, formed in the wake of the Nobbling Edwards murders, was a coalition of often competing cultures: local sheriff's deputies, state police investigators, proud NCIS agents, and FBI profilers. Getting them to share information seamlessly was a bureaucratic battle all its own. Imagine the pre-digital age: boxes of files transported between agencies, phone messages lost, reports typed in different formats. The killer exploited the systemic friction brilliantly. He operated in the seams between jurisdictions: federal parkland, state highways, county lines, where communication was guaranteed to be slow and fragmented. The task force's greatest achievement may have been overcoming this innate friction to finally see the links between the crimes. But by the time they did, the trail was stone cold. The psychological weight on these investigators is a rarely told part of the story. They worked 80-hour weeks, missed their children's birthdays, stared at crime scene photos until the images were burned into their dreams. They developed personal relationships with the grieving families, promising them answers they couldn't deliver. Every promising lead that fizzled out was a personal failure, a blow to their professional identity. Many retired with the case still open, a permanent stain on their conscience. Some took their own notes, their own theories, home with them, unable to let it go. They became, in a sense, secondary victims of the killer's silence. In interviews, retired task force members don't speak with the clinical detachment of TV detectives. Their voices still crack with frustration. Their eyes still hold a glint of unresolved obsession. They talk about the one that got away, not as a cliche, but as a phantom limb, a palpable absence in their lives. The cliffhanger for these men and women is a professional and spiritual one. Did they miss something? Was the key lying on a desk, buried in a transcript, overlooked in a moment of exhaustion? Or were they simply outmatched by a criminal who understood the game better than they did? This question haunts their retirement, a ghost they can never quite exorcise. When physical evidence fails, investigators turn to the landscape itself. Geographic profiling is a forensic technique that uses locations of connected crimes to determine the most probable area where the offender lives or works. It operates on the principle that criminals, like all humans, have an awareness space, places they know well and feel comfortable operating within. For the Colonial Parkway murders, the geographic profile is chillingly clear and yet frustratingly broad. The crimes form a rough crescent along the James and York rivers, with the Colonial Parkway as the central artery. The dump sites of the bodies, where different from the abduction sites, are within a comfortable driving distance, but in deliberately remote, hard-to-access areas. This suggests the killer had an intimate knowledge of the back roads, marshes, and woodlands of the Virginia Peninsula, knowledge that goes beyond what a simple map could provide. He knew which dirt roads were secluded, which clearings were invisible from the main highway, which riverbanks were seldom visited. This points to a local, or at the very least, someone who had spent significant time exploring the area. The expansion to Virginia Beach for the acquisition of the final victims is the profile's most intriguing outlier. It doesn't break the pattern. It expands the killer's awareness space dramatically. It suggests a comfort with the 60-mile drive between the peninsula and the oceanfront, a route that would have been well traveled by military personnel, salespeople, and tourists. The geographic profile would look for an anchor point, a home, a workplace, a relative's house, somewhere within the overlapping comfort zones of the Peninsula crimes and the Virginia Beach incident. This could be a residence in Newport News, Hampton, or even Gloucester Point. It could be a military base like Langley AFB, Fort Eustis, or the now decommissioned Naval Station Norfolk. The killers need to return the final victim's car to First Landing State Park. The gateway to the parkway is a profound clue. It's a compulsion. It's a symbolic return to his hunting ground, a way of claiming the crime for his territory. It's as if he was saying, "This one is mine, too. This belongs here with the others." The cliffhanger of the map is this. If we could somehow plot every single person who lived within that geographic profile between 1986 and 1989 and cross-reference them with a behavioral profile, would the killer's name be on that list? The answer is almost certainly yes. But that list would contain tens of thousands of names. The map gives us the hunting ground, but not the hunter. The shift in weaponry between the first murder and the subsequent ones is a Rosetta Stone for the killer's psychology. The Thomas Dowski murder was visceral, hands-on, involving a knife and ligatures. It was intimate, messy, and required a sustained, close-quarters interaction with the victims. This takes a certain psychological constitution, a need for direct, tactile control, and perhaps a propensity for rage. By the time of the Nobbling Edwards murders 2 years later, the killer had switched to a .22 caliber firearm. This is a significant evolution. A gun creates distance, both physical and psychological. It is a tool of efficiency and detachment. It reduces the risk of the victim fighting back and leaving evidence under fingernails or on clothing. It suggests the killer was learning, adapting to minimize his forensic exposure. It could also indicate a change in his emotional state. Perhaps the hands-on violence of the first crime was too intense, too personal, and he sought a more clinical method. Or it could simply mean he acquired a new tool and incorporated it into his fantasy. The .22 caliber is itself a choice rich with implication. It is not a powerful man-stopper. It is a quiet, almost sneaky weapon, often used for small game hunting or target practice. To use it on a human being suggests a confidence in his marksmanship, or knowledge that a small caliber bullet to the head at close range is just as lethal as a larger one. Its commonness made it virtually untraceable. The killer was thinking forensically, even if he didn't know the term. He was selecting tools that would leave the least amount of evidence and be the hardest to link to him. The fact that he used the same general method, gunshot to the head, on the final two couples suggests he had settled on a preferred, efficient protocol. This evolution from knife to gun is a classic marker of an organized serial offender refining his process. It shows planning, adaptability, and a cold, analytical approach to murder. The cliffhanger of the weapon is a tantalizing forensic possibility. If the .22 caliber pistol was ever used in another crime, a robbery, a domestic dispute, a later murder, and that weapon was recovered and entered into the National Ballistic Database, Nibin, a match could be made. But the database only works if the gun is found, and that gun is likely at the bottom of a river, buried in a forest, or sitting in a private collection. Its deadly history utterly unknown. The disappearance of Cassandra, Haley, and Keith Call occupies a unique and maddening space in the timeline. They vanished on April 9, 1988. Their car was found on April 11th, but their bodies would not be discovered for over 6 months. This missing period, the missing hour of their final moments and the months their bodies lay undiscovered, created a forensic black hole that may have irrevocably damaged the case. Because the car was found locked, with Call's wallet inside, the immediate assumption was that they had voluntarily walked away from the vehicle, perhaps into the woods, and met with an accident or a separate foul play. This initial theory delayed the classification of their case as a homicide, potentially allowing the killer crucial time to cover his tracks. When their skeletal remains were finally found in October, the advanced decomposition made determining cause of death impossible and likely destroyed any biological evidence the killer may have left on the bodies. The missing military ID is the screaming detail in this anomaly. It is the one piece of the puzzle that feels personal, targeted. Was the killer a disgruntled fellow sailor? Was it someone with a grudge against the military? Or was the ID taken as a deliberate red herring to point investigators toward the vast population of military personnel and away from a civilian? The 6-month gap also meant that when the Nobbling Edwards murders happened in September 1988, the task force was not yet operating with the full knowledge that they were likely already investigating a second double homicide from the same killer. The linkage was missed in real time. This temporal disconnect is a critical lesson in cold case investigation. Sometimes the key to solving a series is recognizing it as a series while the trail is still warm. The cliffhanger of the Haley Call case is the ultimate what if. What if their bodies had been found within days? What if trace evidence had been recovered? What if that missing ID had been swabbed for DNA? The answers are lost to the damp Virginia soil in the relentless march of time, a silence within the silence. The landscape of cold case investigation has been seismically altered since 1989. The advent of DNA profiling, the creation of CODIS, Combined DNA Index System, the refinement of touch DNA analysis, and the revolutionary breakthrough of forensic genetic genealogy have solved hundreds of cases once considered hopeless. For the Colonial Parkway murders, this scientific revolution represents a fragile but burning hope. The question is no longer, can we find a clue? But, is there a clue left to find? Evidence degrades. Paper bags decay. Chemicals in old testing kits can contaminate samples. The first order of business for any modern review is an audit of the physical evidence. What exists, where is it stored, and what has it already been subjected to? In 2024, the Virginia State Police Cold Case Unit, in conjunction with the FBI, is undoubtedly conducting this painstaking audit. They are looking for items that have never been tested for DNA, or items tested with primitive techniques in the 1990s that can now be re-examined with vastly more sensitive technology like MVAC or next-generation sequencing. Genetic genealogy is the true game changer. It doesn't require a match in CODIS. It requires only a minute DNA sample from the crime scene. That sample is uploaded to public genetic databases like GeneMatch, where genealogists can build a family tree for the unknown suspect, eventually narrowing it down to a single individual. This technique solved the Golden State Killer case in 2018 and has led to over 200 cold case arrests since 2020, with dozens more in 2024 alone. The hurdle for the Parkway murders is the same as it ever was: obtaining that viable DNA profile. Did the killer leave a single skin cell on a ligature? A drop of sweat on a car door handle he touched? A hair without a root? The search is now microscopic. The cliffhanger of modern forensics is a race against entropy. Every year that passes, the potential for DNA degradation increases, but the technology also improves. It is a delicate, agonizing balance. Right now, in an evidence storage facility in Virginia, a box may hold a key. A technician may be preparing to subject a piece of evidence to a process that didn't exist when the crime was committed. The silence of 3 decades may be milliseconds away from being broken by the hum of a sequencing machine. The impact of Colonial Parkway murders transcended the immediate victims and their families. It traumatized an entire region. For a generation of young people in southeastern Virginia, the Parkway went from a scenic route to a place of primal fear. Parents issued stern warnings. Dates were chaperoned or moved to crowded, well-lit locations. The very concept of pulling over for a private moment became associated with mortal danger. This collective anxiety altered social behavior in subtle but profound ways. The killer didn't just take 8 lives. He stole a sense of security from hundreds of thousands of people. He turned a symbol of American history and natural beauty into a monument to lurking evil. Even today, decades later, mention the Colonial Parkway to someone a certain age from the area, and you will see a flicker of recognition, a shadow crossing their face. They remember the fear. This community trauma also bred a culture of suspicion. People looked at their neighbors, their co-workers, their uncles with a new, wary eye. The knowledge that the killer was likely living among them, shopping in their grocery stores, pumping gas at their stations, created a low-grade societal paranoia. It was a lesson in the banality of evil before most people had heard the phrase. The killer, whoever he was almost certainly a functional member of society. He held a job, paid bills, had conversations. This duality, the friendly facade and the monstrous interior, is perhaps the most psychologically damaging revelation of any serial murder case. It shatters the illusion that we can recognize danger by its appearance. The cliffhanger of the psychological legacy is a question for every community. How many such men live among us now? Their masks firmly in place, their darkness waiting for the right time and the right deserted road. The Colonial Parkway murders are not just a history lesson. They are a cautionary tale about the human capacity for hidden violence, a tale that is being written in other towns, with other roads, right now. One of the most persistent, unsettling theories among investigators is that the Colonial Parkway murders may have inspired a copycat, or even a series of copycats, along the eastern seaboard. The notoriety of the case in the late 80s and early 90s was widespread. The Lover's Lane killer motif is an old one, but the specific staging elements, the untouched valuables, the positioned bodies, could be mimicked. Were the 1990 murders of another couple in Shenandoah National Park, hundreds of miles away, the work of the same man expanding his range, or a disturbed individual borrowing from the headlines? What about the unsolved double homicides of young couples in Maryland and North Carolina during that same era? VidCap was designed to answer these questions, but without definitive forensic links, they remain in the realm of behavioral analysis, which is an art and not a science. The copycat theory is seductive because it could explain inconsistencies within the series itself. Perhaps the Haley Call murder, with its distinct missing ID, was a separate act of violence that was mistakenly absorbed into the legend. Perhaps the Virginia Beach abduction was a different offender inspired by the Parkway mythos, who then tried to stage the scene to match. This theory complicates the investigation exponentially. Instead of hunting one predator, you could be hunting 2 or 3, their crimes blurred together by time and circumstance. It also raises a horrifying possibility. What if the real Colonial Parkway killer only committed 1 or 2 of the murders, and the others are imitations their perpetrators never identified because the investigation was laser-focused on a single profile? The cliffhanger of the copycat theory is a hall of mirrors. It forces us to question every assumption. Is the pattern we see a coherent biography of one man's madness, or a collage of different horrors that we, in our need for narrative order, have glued together into a single, comforting monster? Over the decades, the task force has weathered a storm of false confessions, It is a grim phenomenon common to high-profile unsolved cases. The mentally ill, the attention-seeking, the truly guilty of other crimes seeking notoriety or a change of scenery. They all come forward, claiming responsibility. Each confession must be meticulously vetted, a process that drains resources and plays cruel tricks on the hopes of the families. The Colonial Parkway murders have attracted their share. One man, serving a life sentence for a different murder, provided shockingly accurate details about one of the crime scenes, details that had never been released to the public. He passed a polygraph. For a moment, it seemed like the break, but his timeline didn't match. His physical description was wrong. He was, investigators concluded, a confession addict who had somehow gleaned the details from a careless newspaper article or a conversation with a guard who was a true crime buff. Another confessor drew maps that were wildly inaccurate. Another simply wanted the infamy. Sorting truth from madness in these confessions is a dark art. Investigators look for the holdback detail, a piece of information known only to the killer and the police. If a confessor provides that it's a seismic event, none have. But the existence of these false confessions creates a noise floor that makes it harder to hear a genuine one, if it ever comes. What if the real killer, now old and facing his own mortality, decides to confess? Will he be believed, or will he be lost in the cacophony of liars and the mentally unwell? The cliffhanger of the confession is a paradox of credibility. The man who truly did these things would know things no one else could. But so would the obsessive fan who has studied the case for 30 years. In the end, only physical evidence can corroborate a confession. And so, the wait continues, punctuated by the occasional pathetic cry of "I did it" from a prison cell or a psychiatric ward, a cry that echoes into the same forensic void that has defined this case in the beginning. The rise of the internet democratized the investigation of the Colonial Parkway murders. Websites, forums, and later subreddits and dedicated podcast communities became gathering places for armchair detectives. These digital sleuths have compiled timelines, scanned newspaper archives, created suspect databases, and proposed theories with a level of detail that sometimes rivals the official investigation. Their collective brain power is formidable. They have identified inconsistencies in published accounts, found forgotten witnesses, and kept the discussion alive in the long stretches of official silence. In some famous cold cases, like the murder of Lissa Barons, internet sleuths have played a role in generating new leads. But this power comes with a dark side. The online hunt is unconstrained by rules of evidence, privacy laws, or ethical protocols. Suspects are named publicly, based on speculation and circumstance. Innocent people have found their lives upended by becoming the target of an online witch hunt. Families of victims have had to endure wild, hurtful theories about their loved ones being posted and discussed in perpetuity. This creates a thorny dilemma for law enforcement. Should they engage with these communities? Can they harness this collective energy without endorsing its excesses? Some cold case units have begun to cautiously release sanitized information to the public, hoping to tap into the wisdom of the crowd. But the Colonial Parkway case is so old, so picked over, that the likelihood of an internet sleuth uncovering a definitive clue is slim. The greater risk is a perpetuation of misinformation and the real-world harm caused to the innocent. The cliffhanger of the digital age is this. Is a crowdsourced investigation a powerful new tool for justice, or is it a modern form of chaos, muddying the waters and making the professional's job even harder? The answer is probably both. The digital echo chamber keeps the case alive, but it also risks creating a truth that is more satisfying to the narrative hunger of the audience than to facts of the investigation. The most profound mystery of Colonial Parkway murders may not be who committed them, but why they ended. The last known linked attack was in May 1989, and then nothing. Serial killers of this organization and veracity do not typically just retire. Their compulsive fantasy doesn't switch off. So what happened? The theories are numerous, each with its own implications. Theory 1. Incarceration. He was arrested and imprisoned for another crime, a burglary, an assault, a DUI, and has been behind bars ever since. His DNA may be in the system right now, waiting for a cold case hit. Theory 2, death. He died in an accident, by suicide, from illness, or by the hand of another. Theory 3, relocation. He moved far away, perhaps overseas, and may have continued killing in a new location under a different pattern. Theory 4, debilitation. He suffered an injury or developed an illness that physically prevented him from continuing. Theory 5, psychological satiation. The fantasy was fulfilled, or the risk became too great, and he stopped. This is the rarest scenario for an offender of this type. Each ending tells a different story. If he's in prison, he could be identified. If he's dead, the case may only be solved posthumously through genetic genealogy. If he moved, he left a trail of grief that may not be connected to Virginia. The silence is his final message, his last piece of staging. It leaves everyone, the families, the detectives, the public, in a state of unresolved tension. We are waiting for a punchline that never comes. The cliffhanger of the silence is the ultimate test of investigative endurance. How long do you keep looking for a man who may have stopped 35 years ago? The answer, for the dedicated few, is forever, because as long as the case is open, there is a chance. And as long as there is a chance, the silence is not a conclusion. It is a question hanging in the Virginia air, waiting for an answer. We have reached the end of the known facts. We have walked the parkway in the dark, sifted through the forensic void, stared into the faces of suspects and victims alike. We are left not with an answer, but with a chilling lesson about the architecture of evil and the fragility of our systems against it. The Colonial Parkway murders are a masterclass in the perfect or near-perfect crime. They demonstrate that malice, when combined with intelligence, patience, and a deep understanding of human vulnerability and systemic weakness, can operate with terrifying impunity. The killer was a strategist. He used the landscape as a trap, societal trust as a weapon, and investigative bureaucracy as a shield. He understood that the most powerful thing he could leave behind was not a clue, but a paradox. A paradox freezes time, confounds logic, and ensures immortality in the realm of unsolved mystery. This case holds a mirror up to our own need for narrative. We crave the story, the beginning, the middle, the end. We want the monster to be caught, to be explained, to be placed safely behind bars, both literally and psychologically. The Colonial Parkway murders deny us that comfort. They are a story without an ending, a wound that never scabs over. They force us to sit with the unbearable truth that sometimes the monster wins. Sometimes he walks away. He grows old. He dies in his bed. And the silence he leaves behind is his ultimate victory. This is not a failure of the investigators, though they would doubtless disagree. It is a testament to the horrifying alignment of a particular kind of mind with a particular moment in time before the net of technology could close around him. So, what do we take from this journey into the dark? We take a renewed vigilance, not just the shadowy roads, but the quiet, functional people around us. We take an appreciation for the relentless, often thankless work of cold case detectives who refuse to let the past become irrelevant. We take the painful empathy for the families who have turned their grief into a lifelong mission for truth. And we take a sobering understanding of scale. In a nation of 330 million people, across a history filled with violence, there are voids like this one, silences that have swallowed screams. The Colonial Parkway is one thread in a vast, dark tapestry of unresolved American violence. As of 2024, there are over 250,000 unsolved homicides in the United States. Each one is a universe of loss, a puzzle without a solution. The Colonial Parkway murders are 8 of those universes collided into a single, haunting constellation. But within that scale, within that overwhelming statistic, there's a dangerous temptation to let the specific blur into the general, to let these 8 names become merely a number in a larger, unfathomable tragedy. We must resist that, because the horror of the Colonial Parkway is not in its abstraction, but in its agonizing specificity. It is in a half-empty bottle of perfume on Cassandra Haley's dresser, now evaporated to air. It is in the unplayed guitar chords Keith Call never learned. It is in the future grandchildren Anna Maria Phelps and Daniel Lauer never held. It is in the careers Kathleen Thomas and Rebecca Dowski never built, the middle-aged David Knobling and Robin Edwards never reached. This is the true calculus of the cold case. It is not a subtraction of life, but foreclosure of every branching possibility that life contained. The killer didn't just stop a heart. He erased a world of potential, and he did it with a precision that suggests he knew exactly what he was destroying. He wasn't just taking lives. He was annihilating futures. This is a profound, personal weight that counters the vast, impersonal scale. To honor the victims is to hold both in your mind at once. The staggering breadth of the problem and the devastating, intimate detail of each loss. It is to understand that solving one case, just one, doesn't just close a file. It resurrects a universe. It gives back a name, a story, a reason, and allows a family to finally shift the crushing weight of the why from their own shoulders and place it, rightfully, onto the perpetrator. That is the monumental stakes of the silent, ongoing work in cold case units across the country. It is not clerical. It is archaeological. They are digging for lost worlds. The Colonial Parkway murders are now a textbook example of a deep cold case, one that has survived multiple generations of investigators, technological shifts, and cultural memory. Its very existence has become a blueprint, a case study taught in FBI academies and criminal justice programs on how not just a killer, but a case can become a ghost. The blueprint is built on a foundation of initial investigative scarcity. Those first critical hours and days where the paradox of the scene, the staged car, the untouched valuables sent investigators down divergent paths before the serial link was even conceived. It is reinforced by jurisdictional fragmentation. Federal park land, state highways, multiple county lines, and military-adjacent properties created a bureaucratic maze that the killer navigated with ease, but that investigators had to painstakingly map and overcome. The third pillar is a forensic void of the 1980s, an era on the cusp of the DNA revolution, but still relying on fiber analysis, blood typing, and witness testimony, all of which failed to materialize or were skillfully negated by the offender. But the final, and perhaps most insidious, part of the blueprint is the accretion of time itself. As years become decades, the institutional memory of the case begins to degrade. The lead detective retires, taking his hunches and his unverified suspicions with him. His handwritten notes in the margin of a report become indecipherable to the new detective assigned a bulky box of files. Key witnesses die. Landmarks are bulldozed. The very geography of the hunt changes. The pull-off where a car was found is now widened, paved over, made safe. The darkness where a body was dumped is now a suburban cul-de-sac. The killer, if alive, has had 35 years to craft a new identity, to bury his past, to become someone else entirely. The case doesn't just go cold. It fossilizes. Reactivating it requires a kind of professional defibrillation, a jolt of new energy, new technology, or a fresh pair of eyes willing to ignore the accumulated mythology and look at the bare facts as if for the first time. This is a Herculean task faced by the cold case units in 2024. They are not just investigating a crime. They are resuscitating a historical artifact, trying to hear a whisper buried under 3 decades of wind and rain and forgetfulness. The cliffhanger built into this blueprint is a race against a different kind of entropy, not just the degradation of evidence, but the degradation of memory itself, collective, institutional, and historical. The single greatest rupture in the cold case blueprint has been the advent of forensic genetic genealogy, FGG. It is a paradigm shift so profound it has rewritten the rules of the game. For decades, DNA evidence was only useful if the perpetrator's profile was already in a criminal database, CODIS. It was a closed loop. FGG smashes that loop open. It uses the same tiny, degraded sample, a single skin cell, a fragment of rootless hair. But instead of looking for a direct match, it uses it to build a sprawling family tree. The unknown suspect DNA is uploaded to public genetic databases like GeneMatch or Family Tree DNA, which are populated by millions of citizens seeking ancestry information. The algorithm finds distant cousins, third, fourth, fifth cousins, who share segment of DNA with the crime scene sample. A team of investigative genetic genealogists then uses public records, social media, obituaries, and marriage certificates to build a family tree backward, then forward, narrowing the pool of potential suspects from millions down to a handful of individuals who fit the age, location, and gender profile. It is a digital manhunt conducted in the branches of a family tree. For the Colonial Parkway murders, FGG represents the most credible hope for resolution in 35 years. But its application hinges on a monumental if a viable, uncontaminated DNA profile can be extracted from the evidence. The items that hold the most promise are those that had intimate contact with the killer, the ligatures from the Thomas Dowski scene, the clothing of the victims that he may have handled during staging, the .22 caliber shell casings, oil and skin cells can transfer onto brass, or the interior door handle of the recovered vehicles. If they were ever properly swabbed, the process is underway. In 2023, the Virginia State Police confirmed that evidence from the cases was being reviewed for FGG suitability, but it is a slow, meticulous, and expensive process. It can take thousands of hours of genealogical work and cost tens of thousands of dollars per case. And it is not a magic wand. If the killer has no genetic relatives who have uploaded their DNA to public sites, he remains invisible. If the sample is too degraded, it fails. But the statistics are compelling. As of 2024, FGG has solved over 400 cold cases in the United States since the Golden State Killer arrest in 2018, with a success rate that increases every year as database sizes grow. The cliffhanger here is a scientific suspense story. In a lab right now, a microsample from a 1986 crime scene could be spinning in a centrifuge, its genetic code being translated into a digital sequence. That sequence will be the key that finally unlocks the family tree of the ghost. Or it could be another silent dead end. The wait is for science to finish a sentence the killer left unfinished in 1989. The figure of the former Naval Intelligence officer looms so large over this case that he requires a second, deeper examination in the light of modern profiling. He wasn't just a person of interest. He was, for a long time, the only narrative that made sense to a frustrated task force. Let's dissect why he fits the profile with such terrifying precision. His military training provided the discipline, the understanding of operations, and the comfort with weapons. His intelligence background specifically implied a mindset trained in counter-surveillance, deception, and the manipulation of information, the perfect skill set to outthink a police investigation. His diagnosed psychopathy gave him the emotional vacancy, the lack of empathy, and the propensity for sadistic fantasy that could fuel such crimes. His personal connection to the geography, sailing the Chesapeake, knowing the Parkway, provided the awareness base. His arrogant personality matched the power-assertive need for control and domination. He was, in essence, a ready-made villain. But herein lies the modern investigative dilemma. Does he fit too perfectly? In the decades since, behavioral science has warned of the dangers of confirmation bias and narrative fallacy, the human tendency to weave scattered facts into a coherent story and then ignore evidence that contradicts it. Did the task force, desperate for a break, pour all their hopes into this one man, unconsciously shaping the evidence to fit him? His alibis were unverifiable, but not provably false. The polygraph results were ambiguous. The map he drew was accurate, but so might be the map of any local sailing enthusiast. Without a single piece of physical evidence, a fingerprint, a fiber, a hair, tying any of the scenes, he remains a compelling ghost, but not a convictable one. The advent of FGG could be his final reckoning. If a DNA profile is developed from the crimes, he or his relatives can be tested. Either he will be definitively ruled out, finally closing a chapter that has haunted both the investigation and his own life, or he will be confirmed, solving the case posthumously. The cliffhanger of the suspect is a lesson in the seductive power of a good story. Sometimes the monster in the story is the real monster, and sometimes the story is just a story we tell ourselves to make the randomness feel like a plot. The truth will be written in a double helix, not a detective's hunch. The toll on the families is a chronicle of a pain that evolves but never diminishes. In the first years, the pain was acute, a raw, screaming wound, The frantic searches, the grim identifications, the funerals. Then it became the pain of the investigation. The agonizingly slow drip of information, the false hopes, the frustrating encounters with a justice system that had no answers. As decades passed, the pain metabolized into something else, a permanent state of being, a companion they never asked for. They describe it as a life sentence. Birthdays, holidays, anniversaries are not celebrations. They are milestones of absence. For parents, the unimaginable grief of bearing a child is compounded by the injustice of not knowing who or why. Siblings speak of living in a parallel universe, one where they grew up, married, had careers, while their brother or sister is forever frozen in youthful snapshots, their potential a haunting what if. They have watched their own parents age and die without closure, passing the torch of grief and the quest for answers to the next generation. Their activism is born of this relentless pain. They are not passive mourners. They have learned the language of forensics, of jurisdictional politics, of public records requests. They form bonds with other families of the unsolved, a community no one wants to join. They meet with prosecutors, with state police officials, with members of Congress, advocating for more funding for cold case units and genetic genealogy. They give interviews not for catharsis, but to apply pressure. They understand that in the economy of law enforcement resources, squeaky wheels get the grease. Their vigilance is what keeps the case from slipping from cold to forgotten. In 2024, their fight is focused on one thing: ensuring every shred of physical evidence is subjected to the most advanced forensic testing available. They are racing against their own mortality. The ultimate, unspoken fear for many is not just dying without answers, but that the answer will come after they are gone, and there will be no one left who remembers the sound of their loved one's laugh to truly feel the weight of the resolution. The cliffhanger for the families is a race against a clock that ticks in their own chests. Every day is a battle between the desperate hope for a phone call and the protective numbness of expecting it will never come. The Colonial Parkway itself is a character in this story, a passive facilitator turned active agent of terror. Before 1986, it was simply a beautiful drive. After the murders, its very design was scrutinized and seen as a predator's ally. The lack of lighting, the secluded pull-offs, the thick woods that crowd the asphalt, the long stretches without self-service, an anachronistic concern in the 80s, a chilling reality today. All of these features were suddenly recast as elements of a trap. The Parkway taught a grim lesson in environmental criminology. That place matters. The killer didn't choose these spots at random. He chose them because they offered isolation, control, and easy escape. He understood the psychology of the victims who went there seeking privacy, and he weaponized that desire against them. This transformation of a place has a lasting cultural impact. Local urban legends sprang up. Teenagers dared each other to drive the Parkway at night. The murders entered the folklore of the region, a cautionary tale told to new residents and college students. For law enforcement, the geography forced a tactical change. Patrol patterns were altered. Undercover operations used decoy cars in the pull-offs. A dangerous game of cat and mouse with an unseen opponent. The Parkway became a symbol of the vulnerability that exists in the spaces between our well-lit, secure lives. It proved that evil doesn't need a dungeon. It can operate in a place of breathtaking beauty, using the very things we find serene, the darkness, the quiet, the solitude, as its tools. The cliffhanger of the landscape is this: has the monster left the road? Or does the memory of the violence still cling to the curves of the asphalt, a psychic residue waiting for the right conditions, the right predator to activate it again? Roads don't kill people, but they can be chosen as perfect theaters for those who do. One of the most pressing questions in any serial murder case is, was this his only series? The FBI's VICAP database, now digitized and far more sophisticated than in the 1980s, exists to answer exactly this. Analysts can input the specific behavioral signature of the Colonial Parkway murders: double homicides, couples, secluded scenic areas, stage vehicles, lack of robbery, possible use of a ruse, sexualized violence, and search for matches across the country and across time. Are there unsolved double homicides of couples on the Blue Ridge Parkway? in the early 1990s? In the national parks of the Pacific Northwest in the late 80s? Did a similar pattern emerge in Florida or Texas or California, perhaps after 1989, suggesting a relocation? The work is painstaking, as modus operandi can evolve and be mimicked. There are echoes. The 1996 murders of Julie Williams and Lolly Winans in Shenandoah National Park, while different in method, they were bound and their throats were slit in their tent, shared a core element of a lesbian couple targeted in a secluded federal park area. That case was ultimately solved with DNA, pointing to a single, unrelated perpetrator. The 1990 murders of a couple in a Lover's Lane setting in Maryland had similarities but also key differences. The value of this search is twofold. First, it could potentially solve other cases if a definitive link is made through DNA or other evidence. Second, and more crucial for the Parkway case, if a similar pattern is found after 1989, it shatters the theory that the killer died or was incarcerated that year. It means he was still active elsewhere, and that expands a pool of potential evidence dramatically. The national hunt through data is a silent, digital dragnet. It operates on the principle that no killer is an island. Their habits leave a unique fingerprint on their crimes, a behavioral DNA that can be tracked. The cliffhanger of the database is a question of connection. In a server in Quantico, right now, an algorithm might be silently connecting dots on a map that human eyes have missed for decades, drawing a line from the James River to some other lonely road. And in doing so, for everyone touched by this trajectory, the families, the detectives, the concerned public, the unresolved nature of the crimes creates a specific psychological burden. It is the burden of an open loop. The human brain is wired to seek completion, to find patterns and closure. An unsolved murder is a cognitive splinter. It's an equation with a missing variable that your mind unconsciously tries to solve, over and over, especially in quiet moments. For the detectives, it manifests as professional haunting. They see a face in a crowd that reminds them of a suspect sketch. They read about a new forensic technique and immediately think, could that work on the ligature from the Thomas case? They retire, but the case doesn't retire from them. It pops into their head at 3 a.m., a relentless what if for the public, particularly those who lived through the era in Virginia. The case becomes a reference point for danger. It shapes parenting decisions, personal habits, a general wariness. It fosters a low-level, ambient anxiety about the randomness of violence. This is the killer's secondary victory. He injected a permanent drop of fear into the community's bloodstream. But this psychology also has a flip side. It fuels the enduring fascination. True crime audiences are not just morbidly curious. They are often unconsciously participating in a collective cognitive effort to solve the puzzle, to close the loop. Every podcast listener, every forum poster, is lending their mental energy to the act of resolution. This is not trivial. It creates a sustained cultural pressure that helps keep the case alive in the public square, which in turn keeps pressure on law enforcement. The cliffhanger of the mind is this. Can this collective, subconscious need for an ending actually help cause the ending? Can the weight of a million people wondering, who did this, somehow bend the arc of the investigation toward truth? It's an unscientific thought. But in a case defined by voids, perhaps the sheer mass of focused attention becomes a kind of substance, a force that makes the hidden thing more likely to be revealed. The 21st century media landscape has fundamentally altered the environment of the cold case. The Colonial Parkway murders, once the province of local news and occasional true crime specials, have found a sprawling new life in the podcast era. Deep dive audio series, YouTube documentaries, and dedicated subreddits have introduced the case to a global audience. This media renaissance has a double-edged impact. On the positive side, it generates unprecedented awareness. A tip that might have languished with a local sheriff's office in 1995 can now be sent directly to a podcast producer with an audience of millions, who can then vet and forward it to authorities. It crowdsources attention to detail. A listener in Sweden might notice a chronological inconsistency in a newspaper report that everyone else missed. It keeps the story circulating, creating a drumbeat of public interest that makes it harder for the case to be shelved. The downside is the signal-to-noise ratio. The democratization of the investigation means an avalanche of theories, many baseless or conspiratorial. Online accusations can destroy the reputations of innocent people named as suspects by armchair detectives. The families can be re-traumatized by graphic speculation and invasive questions. For law enforcement, it can create a distracting cacophony. They must now sort through not just official tips, but a flood of digital chatter, much of it repetitive or irrational. Yet, the net effect seems to be positive. Several cold cases have been cracked in recent years due directly to tips generated by podcasts or online communities. The media spotlight functions as a form of sustained global witness. It says, "We are still watching. We have not forgotten." For a killer who likely thrived on a local notoriety and then the silence, this new, endless, digital scrutiny is a form of psychological warfare he could never have anticipated. The cliffhanger of the new media is whether this global, connected brain can succeed where the centralized, analog investigation of the 20th century stalled. Can the hive mind find a needle in the haystack, when the haystack is the entire internet and the needle is a single hidden truth? We must confront the darkest possibility head-on, that the Colonial Parkway murders may never be officially solved, that the killer's identity may pass into history, unknown, his name lost to time. This is the most difficult truth for a justice-seeking society to accept. We have a narrative template: investigation, pursuit, capture, trial, punishment. The Colonial Parkway case rejects that template. It offers instead a story of mystery without revelation, of crime without consequence for the perpetrator. This is an existential threat to our sense of moral order. It suggests that chaos can win, that evil can be not only done, but done perfectly without accountability. If this is the outcome, what then? The meaning of the case shifts from a criminal investigation to a historical and philosophical artifact. It becomes a lesson in the limits of knowledge, a monument to the irreducible mystery of human evil. The victims become not just cold case statistics, but eternal questions. Their story becomes a warning about the fragility of our systems and the depths of human depravity. The investigation becomes a symbol of human perseverance in the face of that void, a testament to the fact that the search for truth has value, even if the truth is never found. The families will be left with tragedy without an author, a pain without a target. Their fight will become a legacy, a story of love that refused to be extinguished by silence. And the killer? In this scenario, he achieves a grim, anonymous immortality. He becomes the ghost in the story, the shadow on the parkway. But even in that, there's a subtle defeat, because if he is never named, he is also never truly known. His motivations, his psychology, his story, they die with him. He becomes not a person, but a force of nature, a violent weather pattern that passed through and was gone. In a way, being caught, being known, is the final form of control for such a killer. To remain unknown is to be, in the end, irrelevant to the narrative. The story becomes about the victims, the seekers, the enduring mystery, not about him. His silence becomes not a triumph, but an emptiness. The cliffhanger of eternity is this, which is worse for a narcissistic predator: to be caught and known as a monster, or to be forgotten, your life's most significant acts attributed to a ghost. We have reached the end of our journey along this dark road. We have stared into forensic void, traced the ghostly outlines of suspects, felt the weight of community's fear, and borne witness to a grief that spans generations. The Colonial Parkway murders are more than a series of crimes. They are a rift in reality, a place where the normal rules of cause and effect, of clue and consequence, broke down. They present us with the nightmare of the perfect ambiguity. But to leave it there in the darkness would be to accept the killer's terms. So let us reframe the conclusion not as an ending, but as a testament to light. The light is in the carefully preserved evidence locker, where a cardboard box holds a .22 shell casing that a dedicated technician will scan with a spectrophotometer next month, seeking traces of organic material invisible in 1988. The light is in computer code of a genetic genealogy algorithm, silently comparing a crime scene DNA snippet to a new upload from a second cousin in Oregon who just got her ancestry results. The light is in the determined eyes of a cold case detective, 10 years from retirement, who spends her weekends re-interviewing the aging friend of a witness from 1989, just in case. The light is in the courage of the families, who transform unspeakable pain into a relentless force for truth. The existential question this case leaves us with is not who did it. That is a forensic question, and it may yet be answered. The deeper question is, what do we owe to the unresolved? Do we owe them our fascination, our fear, our forgetfulness? Or do we owe them our steadfast, quiet commitment to the idea that no story should be left without an ending, no scream should be lost to silence, no life should be erased without a reason finally, definitively etched in the record? The Colonial Parkway murders are a black hole, pulling all light toward their mystery. But around that, we have built a constellation of memory, of science, of duty, and of love. That constellation is our answer. It is our refusal to let the darkness be the final word. The road is quiet now, but the search is louder than ever. It is a whisper in a lab, a click in a database, a prayer in a grieving heart. It is the sound of an answer waiting to be born,